So this is our exposure unit for exposing screens. The first thing you're going to want to do is turn it on. It's on already because I've been exposing some screens. It's good to turn it on a little bit before you're going to expose your screen so that the machine can warm up. Otherwise it can be a little bit tricky to get the light to turn on, but either way, no big deal, but it's good to remember to kind of turn it on before you're getting ready to expose. So this is the on button here. You can see it's on and off. This is the vacuum button here. We'll need this once we have our screen and film in here. These are instructions for different settings depending on what you're using. We're going to be using Rubylith today, so we're going to set it to 100. If you were just using a printed digital transparency or a hand-drawn transparency, it would be 50. And then these are the buttons that you would use to switch out the numbers. So since we're going to be using Rubylith, I'm going to change this to 100. There we go. And this is what I'll press when I'm ready to turn on the light underneath. This is the light underneath where UV light will blast up through the glass underneath, exposing our film to our screen. So here I have retrieved our emulsion covered screen from the dark room. You only want to get your screen when you're ready to expose. You don't want to bring your dried emulsion covered screen out into the light if you're doing something else, because the light will actually start to harden the emulsion on our screen. Because our emulsion is light sensitive, we're going to be blasting it with some UV light strategically with stencils. But if you leave it out in the light, it will harden and it will ruin. And actually this type of emulsion, if it hardens in your screen, is really hard to get out. So only bring your screen out when you're ready to expose. So we'll lift up the lid. There's a small carpet covered little block here that can be helpful to prop up the screen lid while you're arranging things. I also have paper towels. There's a razor over here and some Windex. And this is to clean off the glass. This is a glass table right here. Sometimes if your emulsion is not completely dry, it can stick to the glass. So make sure your emulsion is dry before you put it in here. If there's like little bits of emulsion on the glass table, those could actually block the light and cause those little bits of emulsion to expose to your screen, revealing these weird little dots. So make sure that the glass is really nice and clean before you expose. So I have my Rubylith film that I've placed onto the glass. This printmaking method is different from the other printmaking methods we've done, where you always have to reverse something so that it prints the way that you want it to. In this case, we're making a positive. So however you want your image to print is the way that you want to place your image down onto the glass. If you have words, here I have 2021 written, you want to make sure that you can read that when you place your film down. If you reverse it like this, it's going to print backwards. So make sure that you can read all the words, that the image looks exactly how you want it to print. Then we're going to take our screen. Again, we have this side where the paper goes, and this back side, which has a little bit of a trough, is where the ink goes. So we're going to place it so the flat side is facing down on top of our stencil. And we want to make sure that there's a nice amount of space between our image and this metal frame, because if we put our image too close to this frame edge, it's going to be really hard to print. So I'm going to actually turn my image like this so that it sits nicely in the middle. Sometimes if you're printing something small, you can fit multiple images on the same screen. But again, be careful not to cram. Sometimes when we rush, we try to take shortcuts, and it actually creates more work and more time. So make sure to leave a nice big space around your printing area, and don't put anything too close to this screen edge. So I have my film situated, and my film is underneath the screen, it's not on top. If you put your film positive on top, it's not going to expose as crisply. Then you're going to take these plastic little wires and place them inside the screen. There's two. We have some smaller screens, so you can actually expose two screens at the same time. If you're exposing two screens, you'll want to actually put one in one of these little black straws in one, and one of the little black straws in the other. Since I'm just doing one, I'm going to put them on either side. And this allows the vacuum, which I'll show you in a second, to suck out air so that the screen is nice and flush with the glass. The reason we want the screen to be really flush with the glass is to make sure that this image transfers to the screen as crisply and accurately as possible. I'm going to remove the block. I've got everything set up. My screen is in the middle of the glass, so not too close to this edge or we'll have trouble closing it. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to close the clamps. And now I'm going to start the vacuum, which is going to make a really loud noise. And we're going to wait until all of the air is sucked out. You'll be able to see your screen frame kind of protruding out of the rubber blanket. Be really careful with this rubber blanket. Don't put anything sharp on there because it's really expensive, and if we poke a hole in this, we're gonna ruin our nice vacuum seal. So right now it's sucking out all the air, it's pressing our screen really flat against our stencil so that when we turn on this UV light, our image is gonna transfer nice and crisply. So that's looking good. I can see my screen frame. I've set my numbers to 100, which is for Rubylith, and I'm gonna press start, which is gonna turn on the light underneath. And sometimes just gotta be patient. There we go, third time's the charm. Just be, careful and patient, and don't hammer on the button, just press it a couple times until it decides to turn on. So you can see the light is on. It is blasting UV light onto our screen. Everywhere that is blocked by a stencil is protected by the UV light, and everywhere around it is being hardened by the UV light. So when we remove our screen and wash out our image, all those areas that were blocking the light are soft, and they're just going to wash right out. And all those areas that were hardened by the UV light are going to be stuck onto the screen, creating our stencil. And you can see the numbers counting down, and it's done. So once it's finished, turn off the vacuum. Be patient. It takes a minute for all of the air to get out of the blanket, and we don't want to open it up and wrench it open. We will help it along in a second, but just be, patient. This machinery is really expensive and we don't want to break it. All right, so at this point I'm going to undo the latches. You can hear more air coming out, and I'm just going to kind of very carefully open it up. I'm going to prop it with the block, remove the black straws, lift up my screen, remove my stencil. Sometimes it sticks to the bottom, and then I'm going to move over to the washout booth. make sure that your water is turned on. You can also turn on this backlight, and this will help us see our image area as it washes out. And now I'm just going to carefully wet both sides of the screen with the regular hose. And you can kind of see my image start to appear. So I want to wet the front, and I want to wet the back. Again, just being patient, letting the water kind of do its work, not like forcing it to wash out. Have the water on kind of like a strong setting, but not too strong that it's gonna maybe like blast out areas that are around my stencil. And you can start to see it's coming out over here. So that's looking good. Basically, at this point, you want to make sure that all of your stencil is washed out. If you leave any emulsion in areas of your stencil, it's not going to print. So that's why it's good to use this backlight. You can also hold it up to the overhead light. And I'm basically going to look at my stencil. I can see that like here, there's a little part that didn't wash out. So I'm going to flip it around. Rinse it again, just inspecting. Sometimes there's like little dots. That could be something that was like already in your screen, which is unfortunate, but sometimes something you have to deal with. But for the most part, this is looking good. Once you've washed out your screen, we'll put it back into the darkroom in front of a fan to dry. At this point, it's exposed, so it doesn't matter if it's in the darkroom or not. So you could actually bring it outside and put it in the sun to dry it a little bit more quickly. Another way to get it to dry more quickly is to take paper towel and like dry off the frame area and blot the screen area with some paper towel. But all in all, just putting it in front of a fan will do the trick. And then once it's dry, we're ready to print. Before we start getting set up to print, we want to mix our colors. So because we're doing two transparent colors that will overlap to create a third, we're going to want to start with transparency. So this is transparent base. Open up the transparent base. And we're going to start with transparency because we want a transparent color. If you add transparency to a large amount of color that you've already mixed, it's only going to get slightly transparent. If you start with transparency and add your color, it's always easier to become more opaque, but it's harder to go transparent because you'll need to add a lot of transparency. So we're going to start with a good amount of transparency. And so it depends, the amount of ink that you mix really depends on how large your image is. So if you're printing something that's this big and you're printing 10 of them, you really don't need that much ink. This is just a small little container that I have. I often will save containers, food containers to use so that I don't have to buy them. You can buy Tupperware containers. I save yogurt containers, hummus containers, and that way I can reuse them. It's not bad for the environment, and it's also a free way to get containers. So save your yogurt containers, and then you can use them to mix ink. So I'm starting with like a good amount of transparent base. My image is quite large, but I'm not printing that many of them, and a little bit of screen printing ink goes a long way. So for my first color, I do want it to be kind of a pinky color. So we have some pre-mixed inks that you could look at that you could make more transparent, but I do want to show you how to mix a color. So let's try and find a pink color. We have a medium red and a magenta. I'm kind of wanting it to be a little bit more of like an orange pink, so I might actually try this warm red color. And then a little bit of white to make it more pink. And I might actually add some of this magenta to make it a little more pinky rather than orange. So I've got my white, I've got my magenta, and I've got this warm red. You're gonna need a separate spatula for each one. Please try to not contaminate these because once you get ink in there, it could ruin the whole pot. So I'm gonna start with, just adding a little bit of color. This is going to give me sort of a transparent red. And I'm going to add a little bit of white. Sometimes it's a good idea, if you're making a transparent color, to mix the color that you want first in a separate container and then slowly add it to the transparent base, but we're just going to go for it today. So this is making kind of like an orangey color, which is not what I want. I want to check what it looks like on paper as well by doing a drawdown, so I just want to make sure I haven't lost. Yeah, so it's very, very transparent right now. I do want more color than that, which is good because I am thinking that this orange needs some magenta to make it more pink. So we'll add some magenta. And I want to be careful when I'm adding white because white will always make a color more opaque. This is an interesting color. So let's see what this looks like. Again, we're like really, really transparent, so we can add more magenta. And I'm going to add a little white. Now it's becoming a little bit more what I want. It's probably still very transparent still, which is good, but we want more color. So I'm slowly going to add a little bit more magenta. And more white. Liking this corally color. I do want it to be a little more opaque, so I'm going to add a little bit more magenta. Sometimes I mix my colors like way in advance because you don't want to rush your colors. If you do these drawdowns, you can do them with the different colors you're mixing, and that way you can see how they look together. Sometimes I'll actually even use my finger to do a little bit of a drawdown. Ooh, I am liking this color. This is not what I set out to make. It's kind of like a raspberry mousse now, but I like it. So now I really want to be careful to see. It's getting there. I think I'm going to add a little bit more magenta and a little bit more white, and then see how that goes, because I don't want to go too opaque because I really want those colors to mix nicely on top of each other. It can really be hard to know how a color is going to print until you actually do it. So it's good to like try to do the drawdowns as a test, but in the end, sometimes it's a bit of a gamble. I'm going to add a little bit more magenta and a little bit more white, and then we're going to go for it. You want to make sure they're really well mixed, otherwise you'll get streaky prints. It's good to label your colors as well. So for this one, you know, there's about like maybe 85% transparency. So, you know, if I were to go and be like, ooh, I like this raspberry mousse color that I mixed, and I'm printing something later on, but I need an opaque color, you know, you want to make sure that you note how much transparency is in your ink. Otherwise, when you go to print, you're going to have a weird transparent color next to your opaque colors. So it's always good to label them. So I'll probably call this raspberry mousse 75% transparency. So I'll know that it's really, really transparent. All right. So now I'll clean up all these spatulas in the sink and get ready to set up for printing. You'll also want to cut your paper down to size so that everything's set and ready to go before you put ink on your screen. Now that our screen is dry, our ink is mixed, our paper is cut, we're going to prepare our screen for printing. So you'll notice there's like a bit of a border around the edges. Depending on, you know, if I'm printing on this side, I don't need to worry about it over here. If we had two images on our screen, we might want to tape off the other image. And this is so that when we're printing, ink doesn't squeeze out of these open areas onto our printing area or onto our paper. So screen printing, because it's water-based ink, it's really easy to clean up. You can use soap and water, but once you get a little bit of ink somewhere, it gets everywhere. So right now I'm just taping up on the paper side of my screen these open areas. Being careful with my scissors to not leave them on the screen, but have them like safe beside it. And here my emulsion actually goes all the way to the edge, so I don't need to worry about that. You'll also want to check and see if there's any like what we call pinholes, so you can hold it up to the light and check if there's any hole, like open areas in your screen that you don't want to print. You can cover them with a little piece of packing tape and they won't print. But again, this is the side of our screen that is going to sit face down on our screen printing table. Because if you try to print like this, you know, there's space underneath, so it's not going to print. So I'm going to flip it over. So now this is my ink side with the little trough that goes in, and then the flat side is the side that's going to go flat on my table. So to set up, I'm going to put my paper that's already cut down in a safe place, and I'm going to put my ink here, or you could put it on like a little stool next to you, and I just want to keep my ink away from my paper so that it doesn't get onto it. So I have my screen face down like this. I'm going to put it into the clamps. So put the frame edge, bring it up a bit, and these just go up and down by turning them. Place it so that the clamps are on top of the screen frame. Because the screen is a little bit longer, actually, you know, you could print it this way, or you could print it this way. I think it'll actually be easier to print this way because I can use a shorter squeegee. So I'm gonna place it in like this. It's also nice to see your image as you're printing it as well. And I'm gonna tighten down the clamps. So this is our screen hinge, and you want to make sure it's nice and tight. Not too tight that you can't loosen it afterwards, but because you want to make sure that your screen isn't going to move while it's in here. Because if it moves, it's going to move to a different place and you're going to print in a different place. And basically, these clamps are attached to hinges that lift up and go down. We have these carpet-covered blocks that you can use to prop up underneath. Sometimes they do stay. This one doesn't want to stay anymore. But you can just prop it up like that. I, in the past, have like used my head to hold it up while I rearrange things underneath, but that can be a little bit trying over time. You could also use your packing tape, whatever you need to prop up your screen while you're doing things underneath. Underneath the screen, there's already a piece of acetate, and then we have screen tables with a vacuum. So there's a little switch here. It's turning on the vacuum. The vacuum will suck your paper to the table so it doesn't move when you're printing it. And there's a lever here that turns it off and then turns it on. And that's gonna like make sure our paper doesn't move while we're doing things. But the first thing we're gonna wanna do is to print onto our acetate. This is gonna help us register our print, and I'll show you a couple techniques in terms of registration. So we've got our screen in the clamps. Now we're gonna get set up over here. We've got our block for propping the screen. This is a little, it's not the best. This is gonna hold my squeegee. We have a lot of different sizes of squeegees, but basically I want one that's about an inch wider than my image on both sides. So let's see what we got. This one looks kind of small, but it's actually the perfect size. So there's 1 inch on either side. Go on our handy little holder like this. And then I'm gonna get my ink. So my ink is here. And yeah, so now I think we're ready to go. Once everything is set up, you're ready to start printing. So the basic movement of screen printing, this is our squeegee. It has this rubber side and then this metal handle. And I hold it with 2 hands like this with my thumbs underneath. And we're gonna do what's called a pull first, just to demonstrate. So here's my squeegee at a 90-degree angle. I'm gonna pull it down so it's at a 45-degree angle so that edge of the rubber part is pressing against my screen. And then with firm but even pressure, I'm gonna pull down. So that's to print, that's a pull. And then to flood, which is also a very important part of screen printing, which is where we're putting ink back into our stencil. So you should have a little bit of a line of ink here. You're gonna grab it, push it across your stencil, again, evenly and firmly. You wanna make sure that there's ink in all areas of your image. The reason we flood is so that our stencil doesn't dry out while we're printing. You'll probably forget at some point, but it's okay. There are ways that we can fix that as well. So there's the 2 actions, pulling and flooding. So the first thing I'm gonna do is put a line of ink at the top of my screen. Not a ton of ink, because we don't want to get too messy, and not too little that it won't flood the entirety of my screen. And this might take a minute to like figure out how much you actually need. But here's a pretty good amount of our raspberry mousse. I'm gonna take my squeegee, and so the first thing I'm doing is printing onto this acetate, because that's gonna help us register our print. So to flood my screen for the first time, I'm actually gonna pull it in this direction. So you can see actually right there, it didn't flood the entire way, so I'm gonna come back and grab some more. So now I'm going to print onto my acetate. So I put the screen down, pressing firmly, holding it at a 45-degree angle, and pulling down, lifting up. This is where we're gonna flood, so there's a line of ink back here, and I'm gonna push back across my image, and now there's ink in all the areas. I'm gonna put my squeegee down on my squeegee holder over here, take my carpet block and put it over here. So now I can see underneath my image has printed, and now I can use this as a guide to place my paper. So here I have my paper. I'm gonna slide it under the acetate. Be careful, the ink is still wet on the acetate. And I'm basically kind of eyeballing where I want my poster to land on here so that the borders are even. that's looking good to me. Once I have my paper in the right spot, I'm going to actually turn on the vacuum because I'm going to put registration marks with tape so that I don't have to use this acetate every time. You can use the acetate. I find it gets a little bit cumbersome. For a simple print like this, especially because it's our first layer, we can make these little tape corners that will act as registration marks so we can just keep printing. And I'm moving quite quickly because I don't want this ink to dry in the screen because it is water-based and it dries quickly. So I'm going to turn on the vacuum. All right, so when it makes that sound, it means it's sucking it down. I'm going to move this away. Grab my masking tape. And just make little corners so that we know where to place our paper each time. Sometimes I'll double stack the tape, and that way there's like a little ledge for the paper to butt up against. I'm going to do it on one corner, and then I'm going to do it on this far corner as well. Try not to touch your screen on the underside because there is ink there. Also always good to pull a proof on newsprint to make sure that it's printing the way you want. But sometimes I'm bad and I just go straight to my paper. So let's see what this looks like. So my screen is flooded, my paper is in place, and I can put subsequent papers in the same spot. I'm going to put my screen down, grab my squeegee. I'm going to grab a little bit of the ink at the top. Press down, 45-degree angle, pull down firmly and evenly, lift up, grab that little line of ink, push it back through my image. I can turn off the vacuum table now, and I can see my pulled print. So this is actually maybe more opaque than I wanted, but we'll see how it goes. Maybe I got too excited with my magenta, but we'll see what happens. So this is printed really nicely and evenly. I only did one pull. I'll show you, sometimes you might have to do two depending on what your image is. So now I'm going to move this over to the drying racks. So to print my next one, I don't need the acetate anymore. I can just put my paper in these corners. You can always double check with acetate if you want to make sure, but it should be in the exact same spot. I'm going to turn on the vacuum, bring it down, and print. If you see that there's like maybe some ink still in your screen at another point, you can always come back to the top, grab more ink, and do another pull down. Sometimes your print will stick to your screen. That's okay, just make sure you peel it off before you flood. So again, grabbing that ink, pushing that through. Because if you flood when your image is still attached to your screen, it's gonna be all blobby in certain parts. So there's print number 2. And you're just going to keep doing this action until you're through with your addition. So some things that can happen are your ink dries in your screen. In that case, you can just proof a bunch on newsprint to try and re-moisturize the screen. If it's really not coming out, you can, before you flood, grab a wet sponge with ink, kind of clean the area until the ink breaks up, and then dry it with a paper towel so it's not super wet. the best on this side. Hopefully my paper didn't move when I lifted up my screen, or I might get like a double image. But that's the nice part about the vacuum table is it just stays in the right spot. If you accidentally put too much ink on your image and you notice, so there I just did a double pull, you notice that ink is kind of like squishing out and making kind of like a halo around your stencil and not a nice crisp line. You can again proof on newsprint until you get rid of it. Maybe remove some ink from your screen and continue printing. So basically, I always find proofing on newsprint, if things are going wrong, is the best way instead of just wasting all your good paper. If you start to run out of ink, you can always just add more. Especially if you're having trouble flooding, that might be because you need more ink. Once you've pulled your last print, you don't need to flood your screen. To clean up, we're going to scrape up all this excess ink because we can use it again. All right, I got all the ink from there. I'm also going to take the ink off of the squeegee because we also want to clean that. Once you've scooped up all the excess ink, put the lid on our ink. And we'll move over to the spray booth. So we'll unhook the hinges, pull it out, and walk over there. You'll want to clean up your screen area, so remove your tape. Don't use packing tape on the screen table, only masking tape, because the packing tape will leave like a gross sticky residue. You'll also want to clean off your acetate, especially if somebody's waiting for the table after you, because there's only 3 tables. Make sure that you clean up your area quickly and efficiently so that people aren't waiting around for you. And it's never fun to have to clean up somebody's image off of the acetate. So I'm just using water and then drying it off with paper towel. All right, cleaning the screen. You can clean your squeegee and spatula first. doesn't really matter the order. Make sure to get all of that ink off. Especially off the squeegee. Make sure, ink can sometimes hide on this edge here. Make sure that you clean it fully, because if somebody goes to use your squeegee after you and there's pink ink on it and they're printing something in blue, it's going to be bad. Once you've washed the squeegee, dry it with paper towel or your apron, and then hang it back up where you got it. When cleaning the screen, make sure you take your tape off first. I find it hard to take the tape off after it's wet. So if we were going to print this screen again in a color, we just need to clean the ink off, let it dry, and print it again. Or say you had another image on here that you need to print, clean it out, and then you'll be ready to print again. So to clean the ink off your screen, most of the ink is in this area. Spray it down, just using this regular sponge. You want to be quick about cleaning your screen so that the ink doesn't dry. Obviously, if there's kind of like a lineup for the washout sink, you might have to wait a minute. If you find that the ink is drying in any of your image that you need to print, you can use this cleaner called Grease Lightning, spritz it on to your image, and after you scrub it, it should be So if we were printing this layer again, we would just put it either outside to dry or in front of a fan. Once it's dry, you can print it again and go through the same process. If, however, we wanted to put our second layer on this screen, we need to reclaim it. Which means removing the emulsion from the screen. So we're going to use this Silk Screen Emulsion Remover. It's not the worst for you, but you do want to turn on the ventilation. And with this, you want to be patient, because it works better if you wait. I'm going to spritz one side of the screen. I have this sponge that says emulsion on it. It's spray painted pink to differentiate it from this sponge. And this is so that we don't mix them up, because if you use this sponge to take emulsion off of your screen and somebody goes to clean their screen with this, but they want to keep their emulsion on their screen, the emulsion remover in this sponge might take off their emulsion. So we'll try to reserve this sponge for emulsion so that that mistake doesn't happen. So I spritz the screen. Scrubbing it. Then I'm going to turn the screen around and do the same to the other side. My screen was already wet because I just cleaned it, but if you were reclaiming a dry screen, you would want to wet both sides first. So I can already see the pink stuff kind of loosening up. But the more I scrub and the more I let it kind of like soak in, the easier it's going to come off. So actually I'm wiping the image off now. Different emulsions come off in different ways. This one seems to come out pretty well, especially if, since I just coated it yesterday. most of my image has been removed just through scrubbing, I'm going to clean my sponge now, just in case somebody actually accidentally uses it. And I'm going to spray off the chemicals from my screen. So most of the image has been removed, but I can still see some of the emulsion in the side. So now we're going to use the power washer. So to use the power washer, you want to make sure that the water is on first. So I can see right now there's no water. The water is that blue handle on this side. So I'm going to turn it so that it's in line with the hose. Double check. All right, so it's on now. And now I'm going to turn on the pressure washer motor underneath, which is this blue machine, and the on button is right back here. So I'm going to turn it on and then turn on the hose. And now blast it out of my screen. Once I'm finished, I'm going to turn the motor off. And then if nobody was using it after, I could turn the water off. So it's important that it's water on, and then motor off, water off. The water should always be running when the motor's on, before you turn the motor on, or you're going to break the pressure washer. So at this point, I'm going to just double check, hold it up to the light, make sure everything's looking good. If there's any areas left in there, you can focus on blasting those out. So I'm going to turn it back on. So you can really focus attention on certain spots to blast out hard to get emulsion. So at this point, when your screen is completely clean and no clogged areas, you can put it to dry in the sun, you can put it in front of a fan, and once it's dry, you can coat it again, let it dry, and then expose it. Okay, so after your first layer has dried, since we're using water-based ink, the drying process is much faster. These should be dry within, depending on your application of ink, if it's a nice thin layer, about 10-15 minutes, they'll be dry. I'm going to keep these in a safe place so I don't get any ink on them. And then I exposed my second layer. After washing out my screen, I coated my screen again and let it dry, and then I exposed my second layer of Rubylith to my screen, so it's ready to go and it's dried. I've also, in advance, mixed my ink. Again, I used less colored ink this time into my transparency because I found my pink to be quite opaque. And then I did a little drawdown with the colors to see how transparent my green was and how it would look on top of the pink. So we're going to have a real watermelon print here. So I have my squeegee ready. That is slightly larger than my image. My ink is ready. And now I just have to tape off my screen again on the borders. All right, and now we're good to go. Clamping it in the hinges again. And move it over. Not so close to the edge. There we go. make it nice and tight so it doesn't move. And then we're ready to go. So I put my carpeted block underneath just so it's raised off of the plexi at first. Gonna put a nice bead of ink at the top. And I'm gonna flood my screen, so put ink into stencil and then let it sit on top of the plastic and bring it down, lift it up, again remembering to flood it. All right, so now we've printed on our acetate, and now we're going to line up our image underneath the acetate to figure out placement. So I have my first layer here, slide it up underneath, and I'm gonna line it up with, I actually have like this border around it, so it's actually quite easy for me. So depending on what your image looks like, you'll be lining it up, the image underneath. Okay. That looks good to me. So at this point, I'm going to turn on the vacuum because I don't want my print to move while I'm putting down the tape corners. Got my masking tape. All right, now we're ready to print. Squeegee, 45 degrees, pull down, lift up. Don't forget to flood. So there's our print. You can see that translucent green was like the perfect amount of transparency. So there's like a bit of a blending happening there where it's overlapping with the pink. This is, I don't know what color that is, a darker green, I guess, in here and in the face. So 3 colors made with 2, and I think it makes a pretty cool looking print. So for your second print, we've put these tape corners down, but sometimes I don't like to rely fully on them because depending on, you know, discrepancies in the size of your paper that you cut, or, you know, there could be slight movement. Sometimes I like to double check with the acetate. Turn this on. Right, so it looks good to me. And then you'll continue this for the duration of your edition. And then once you've finished, you'll clean up like we did for the first layer. And then if you're printing your second color in a different color, you can wash it out and then wait for it to dry, print a different color. or you can reclaim your screen and code it anew for another print.